Good evening, everyone, and very welcome to our last webcast before our summer break. You have just been watching some images submitted to us from Philip Hills for the Stereo Nova concert at the European Capital of Culture opening ceremony in Greece a few months ago. We have a blog post about this on our website as well if you want to look the images in your own pace and read a little bit more about the event. We also thank him, Phil, for submitting to our showcase reward program, which means that if you get your pictures promoted on our website, then you also get a free upgrade to the next version of Capture. So we encourage everyone to submit their shows to our showcase reward program, which you can also read more about. There are no retakes in live, so I'm just going to move on. Today's main topic is MVR workflows. So I'm basically going to give a presentation. I will be open to questions as I'm doing that, so make use of the chat here to send me questions as we go. If you have questions about things that are not related to MVR workflows, then feel free to ask them as well, but I might save them for the end of the webcast. So let's roll straight to the presentation about MVR workflows. And straight off, I will say that I'm not going to be launching different design softwares and sending MVR files back and forth between them. What I want to do is dig a little bit deeper into the MVR format, what Capture can do with it and cannot do with it. So to give you a chance to understand what the limitations are, because by the end of the day, that's what decides if you can build a workflow on it or not, with the needs that you have. So let's start with a little bit of background. MVR is tightly connected to another format called GDTF. If you want to read more about these formats, there is a dedicated website for it. It's called gdtfshare.com, as the link suggests here. On that site, you can read that GDTF was originally conceived and jointly developed by MA Lighting, Vectorworks, and Roby Lighting. It says GDTF here, but it means both GDTF and MVR, and in general, you can think of the formats as a pair of formats that work together. Now, you can have GDTF without MVR, but you can't really have MVR without GDTF. Now, even though these three companies are the driving forces behind it, in reality, there is a fourth company which is the architect of the format. This is Dearsoft in Germany. They are responsible for the Braceworks package in Vectorworks for the MVR and GDTF design, as well as for a new product called Production Assist, which deals with more, or not more, but other production-related requirements such as load calculations, trailer packing, and more things of a more practical nature rather than, let's say, lighting design, for instance. So now I want to drill into what is in MVR, and there is a lot of file format names and abbreviations. So let's start with the file formats that are related to MVR. That is MVR, which stands for My Virtual Rig. That is a file, a zip archive that contains other files. An MVR archive contains an XML file which describes the design. There is potentially one or many 3ds files, that is 3D model files of the 3D environment of the design. And there are GDTF files, general or generic device type format files, which are fixture personalities or libraries or templates or whatever your console prefers to call them. In a more recent move, there may also be GLB files to replace the 3DS files. GLB files are better 3D model files. They are of a new and recent format with support for more modern technologies, specifically materials. Next, we have some file formats that are unrelated to MVR, yet often get confused. So these formats are not relevant to MVR, starting with GLTF. GLTF is a text version of GLB 3D model files that are not used by MVR. It sounds very close to GDTF, but it's GLTF and it's not the same. Capture can export GLTF files, and when doing so, we also embed some extra information about fixtures and patch and stuff, which is also unrelated to MVR. And finally, to make matters even worse, we have GLDF, which is the generic lighting device format, I think. Another fixture personality format developed by Dialux and Relux, which is not relevant to what we're doing here. So if you've had enough of acronyms, let's move on to an example and some graphics instead. Here we have a very simple design. There is a box to represent the stage. We have a piece of truss and a lighting fixture. The box is 6 by 8 meters. It is 10 centimeters thick, and it's been named stage, which you can see in the unit. I can't point all over there because my finger disappears if I move it further, but up in the unit property at the top of the selected items list, it says stage. Next, we have a 3-meter ProLight truss, which again in the units field up there, it says LX1. Apart from that, it's completely standard. It's at 4.8 meters, a piece of truss. And finally, a moving head. It's a Claypaky X-Core profile. The unit is 1. It is, well, you can see on the location it says LX1. That's because it's on the LX1 truss. And I've given it channel number 10. And it is patched on DMX Universe 1, channel 1, which is scrolled out of range on the pretty long property list, but it is patched. If you export this in Capture to an MVR file, you will get an MVR file, no surprise there. But as I mentioned, MVR files are zip archives. That means you can use software like 7-zip to look inside the MVR file. If we do that, we discover that it contains 4 files. It has an XML file called General Scene Description. It has 2 3DS files and 1 GDTF file. Let's start with taking a look at the General Scene Description file. This is an XML file, and XML is a text format in a specific format, of course, it's the XML format. And I'm going to highlight 3 or 4 important segments of the XML file here. This is the entire General Scene Description file in the MVR that we just exported, or I did this morning. The first object here is called Scene Object. Technically, it's an element of the XML file, and it has an attribute called Name, which is Stage. This follows from the unit property in Capture, which transfers into the name attribute of scene objects. Inside it you will find a matrix element with lots of numbers and curly brackets. A matrix is a fancy way of describing rotation, position, scale, and even skew. In this case, if you know how to read all those numbers, it basically says it's 49.99999 millimeters below level 0. That's because the 10 centimeters box is moved slightly down. And it's referring to a 3ds file called a pretty cryptic thing. Next we have a truss element. It also has a name attribute, LX1, that's the unit I gave it in Capture. Again, we have a matrix, in this case saying that it's 4.8 meters up in the air. Measurements in MVR are in millimeters, so 4,845 is millimeters. Now, instead of referring directly to a 3ds file, it's actually referring to a symbol. So it says symdef here, which is for symbol definition, which you can find up here in the file. And inside that, it's actually pointing to a 3ds file. Now, unfortunately, the MVR specification is not clear when symbols should be used. It can be used by the exporting software whenever it deems it a good idea. In the case of Capture, you get symbols for trusses, and that's it. Sorry, here we are. Moving on, we have a fixture element. It's the axe core profile. It says here in the name. There's a matrix with the position of the fixture, and then we have the GDTF spec. And this is a file name for the GDTF file in the MVR that contains the definition, the personality of the fixture, followed by GDTF mode, which describes which GDTF mode, or well, DMX mode of the fixture it is using. And after that, we have just about all the useful information you can put in an XML file about a fixture. We have a fixture ID, a unit number, and a DMX address. Fixture ID number 10 comes from the channel number in Capture. Unit number comes from the unit property. And then we have the DMX address, which in MVR language is a number from 1 and up. So channel 1 on universe 2 would be 513, since each universe has 512 channels. So if we want to know more about this fixture, we can look inside that GDTF file there. So if you remember, these were the contents of the MVR, that there is a GDTF file here. And GDTF, just like MVR, is also a zip archive. So in 7-zip, you can just double-click the GDTF. Crap. I will soon get to the GDTF. Before I get to the GDTF, let's take a look at the 3ds files that we have inside the MVR. And much to nobody's surprise, they are 3D models of the truss and the stage. Nothing weird about that. Now let's take a look at the GDTF file, which is a zip archive that contains an XML file, which is called description XML. There could be a lot more files here, but in this case there is just the description XML, which looks like this. Now I've written placeholder all over it because this is a special type of GDTF file that is sometimes called placeholder or proxy or dummy. It is the most basic GDTF file you can imagine. The only purpose it has is to identify the type of fixture and the DMX mode that it is in by the amount of channels it has. So this is a very basic GDTF file which basically only has the fixture name up here. It defines an attribute definition for dimmer, and the entire DMX mode is basically just made up of dimmer channels, the same amount of channels as the mode uses. So this way we can identify a DMX mode by the number of channels it has, although we fake it by putting dimmer channels in here. So there's no pretty picture of the fixture, there are no gobo images, emitter definitions, or anything like that, no 3D object. It's a very basic file. So a legitimate question is, why on earth are we doing this type of placeholder GDTF file in the first place? It doesn't seem like a good idea to do. And if you have questions, please keep them coming, or please write one in the chat. So, to begin with, we don't own the libraries in Capture. The libraries in Capture are supplied to us by Atlabase, which is a different company. There is no ownership relation between Capture and Atlabase, apart from the fact that some of the Capture owners are also part of the owners of Atlabase, but there's no direct ownership relation between the companies. Capture subscribes to libraries from Atlabase. As such, we do not have the rights to include the libraries in exports. So we do not have the permission to generate a GDTF file with library data inside. We do not own the data. Even if we owned the data, we could not generate a GDTF file because we would only have data relevant to visualization. We would not have purely textual information, which you could find in a control channel. We don't have information about functions or triggering functions like hold the control channel for 3 seconds and then flash the dimmer channel to activate this and that. So even if we owned the data, we would not be able to generate a GDTF file. So that would also be a no-go. And at this point, someone could say, well, why don't you use GDTF files as libraries in Capture then? But the truth is that wouldn't work either for a number of reasons. To begin with, we have more data about visualization in our library than GDTF has. So if we did visualization based on GDTF, it would be like sending you 8 to 10 years back in time to what visualization looked like in Capture then, which, yeah, you would be going back pretty quickly. Furthermore, there is no support for GDTF files, and by support here I'm talking about somebody helping you when you have a problem. So if you find the GDTF file for a fixture online, now admittedly that would probably come from the manufacturer of the fixture, so it will be of high quality. But even so, it won't be free from mistakes or problems. So if you encounter an issue with the GDTF file, there is not really, you can submit feedback, but you cannot trust on anyone to fix something for you in a day or two, which is something that we feel is incredibly important, that our users can get stuff fixed in the library if there are issues. There's also limited availability of GDTF files, not just in the sense that there are few files available today, which could get better over time, but it's also that a manufacturer today may not be interested in creating a GDTF file for you of deprecated fixtures or fixtures that are no longer sold. Whereas we feel, even if you request a 10 or 20-year-old fixture, we need to get that into the library for you. So as you can see, GDTF is simply not a good fit for libraries in Capture in any way. And I have to point out here that putting full fixture definitions in the MVR is a choice made by the designer of MVR. It would absolutely have been possible to create MVR without the need for full fixture definitions, just as it has been possible for many years to send lighting designs in the form of plots without having to ship along library files for the fixtures in the show. So the fact that MVR requires GDTF files is for reasons of priorities and future visions and strategies of the companies behind the format. It's, in our opinion, not something that is strictly needed to transfer a lighting design between softwares at all. And that's why we stick to these placeholder GDTF files. So if you want to build a workflow on MVR, including capture, one of the questions will be, what information will you lose when you go out of capture to MVR? Because MVR doesn't support everything that capture supports. So some of the top things are, if you often find yourself grouping objects and you put objects in that group in different layers, then this is not supported by MVR. In this example, I have created 3 different layers, one for fixtures, one for the stage, and one for the truss, and I have grouped the fixture with the truss. If we export this to MVR, we run into a problem that you cannot nest layers under layers. So in the MVR file, the top block is the stage layer, which contains the stage. Then we have the truss and fixture layers, which are empty. And finally, there is an unnamed layer, which contains a group object with the truss and the fixtures, and there's no layer information left. The reason for this is that layers in MVR are like layers in Vectorworks, which is not a surprise because MVR has been designed for Vectorworks. Vectorworks has a concept of classes, which are more similar to layers in Capture or in almost any other software for that matter. So therefore, it's a poor fit for Capture files. Now in MVR 1.5, which is quite recent, they've actually added classes. But again, they miss things like colors, which are common among layers in design software, so even so, it's a bit problematic. If you use unit properties in Capture for fixtures and you use more than just numbers, then you will run into a problem that MVR only supports numbers in the unit number property element. So on export, Capture removes any text from the unit property and leaves you only with a number in the unit number field, because MVR only supports numbers there. On export from Capture, you do not get any materials in MVR. The main reason for this is that in the first versions of MVR, there was only support for 3DS. And translating Capture's PBR materials into 3DS is basically impossible, and we decided to leave it out. These days, they also support GLB, which could support PBR materials, but then we are at the point where we ask ourselves, which software are you going to go to from Capture that also supports PBR? At the moment, we don't see what that would be. So we're open to doing this, but only when we see that there is a software that you would realistically export to that also supports PBR materials. And then finally, and this is the most sad part, if you work with conventionals other than just plain LED conventionals, there is a lot of things that MVR does not support, like focusing fixtures without using focus points, which is a Vectorworks and WYSIWYG concept. It will not contain information about iris, shutter cuts, barn doors. There's no circuit, purpose, or textual or focus field. There's no notes field. And there is almost at least no capability of supplying filter or gobo information or any other kind of fixture accessories. Yeah, that's just the sad reality of things. If you import MVR files into Capture, there are a few issues as well. If the MVR file contains full GDTF files, then these are scrapped on import, and you have to identify each fixture with a Capture library fixture, and after that point the GDTF files will have been forgotten. Then there are a few new features in MVR 1.5 which are difficult for us to support because the way it's designed is ever so slightly different from how it works in Capture. Classing, that I mentioned before, is one of them. They've also added an alignment concept which is supposed to help preserve focus of conventional fixtures. Unfortunately, it's been designed in a way that it doesn't really work with placeholder fixtures, which is very troublesome for softwares that cannot export their libraries like Capture or WYSIWYG or even older Vectorworks libraries. There's also a new concept of overrides, which in theory could let you embed filters, gobos, and customize wheels, but again, it is based on a full GDTF file, and they have not bothered to make it work with placeholder fixtures at all. So at this point, I am thankful that there is a question from Harm, who writes, if I export an MVR file to Grand MA3, replace the placeholder fixtures with MA fixture files, will 3D information be correct? And will multi-instance fixtures be in the correct orientation? So, in GDTF, there is a standard, let's say, of how fixtures should be oriented. And Capture follows this standard on export. So in theory, you should be perfectly able to replace a GDTF with another GDTF of the same fixture, and the orientation should be correct. As a result of that, multi-instance fixture orientation should also be correct. This, of course, is based on the requirement that the GDTF files you have been designed with the correct orientation to follow the GDTF spec. But yes, that should work and should not be a problem. At least with moving heads, where there is a clear sense of orientation. It gets tricky with things like strobe lights, where it can be more difficult to argue about what is up and down and front and back. But with moving heads, that should work fine. So I've touched what you will lose on export from Capture, and I've gone through what you will lose on import into Capture. One of the arguments or selling points of MVR is the idea of going back and forth between softwares. So you might start off in one, do something more in another, move on to a third, and so on. The idea is great, but as long as there is a lot of information lost during import and export, it's very difficult. You can probably get some things to work between softwares, but it will be something specific that works between two specific softwares. So if you want to build round-tripping workflows, you really need to try the specifics out with your specific softwares. The fact that someone imports or exports MVR cannot be taken as a sign that you will be able to do that kind of workflow at all. And with that, I have exhausted my slides. And I would be open to questions if there are any. It seems like probably there are not. I will point out that we did several enhancements to MVR import primarily in Capture 2023 Mark 1, which we released a few weeks ago. The noteworthy improvements are support for GLB files in MVR and support for GDTF 1.2 files as well. So if you haven't already upgraded to 2023.1, I encourage you to do that on our website. And if you haven't been exploring what's in our library in some time, I would also encourage you to do that, because we've been busy adding new objects in the library. And by objects, I mean, well, the objects category, so you will find new actors, for instance. And also a large amount of what we would call custom truss pieces, pieces that have been drawn by hand by us. So it's more specific things. We have things like tank traps, belay towers and stuff like that, ballasts, and more truss tower parts, for instance. So in case you've missed that, I encourage you to go and have a look at that. And as it seems there are no other questions popping up either, I'm going to wish you all a lovely summer. We will be back after a summer break here at some point in August or early September. And I look forward to seeing you again then. Thank you so much for watching, and see you soon.